Welcome again to Leadersphere and to this panel on year one of the COVID-19 era. My name is Marina Sharp. I'm Assistant Professor of International Studies here at RMC Saint-Jean, and I'm going to be moderating this morning. And as mentioned, all papers that will be presented on this panel are published in a special issue of International Journal, and I'll put a link to that issue in a moment in the chat. The panel will begin with Bruno Charbonneau, who is Associate Professor of International Studies at RMC Saint-Jean. His paper examines how the UN Security Council has responded to the pandemic. This will be followed by Stephen Brown, Professor of Political Science at the University of Ottawa. His paper focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on development assistance. Next will be Wesley Wark, who spent his career at U of T's Manque School of Global Affairs and is now a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa. He will address how Canada can contribute to building a better global health security early warning system in the post-COVID era. Then Shahar Hameri, Associate Professor at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland in Australia, will discuss whether COVID-19 heralds the end of globalization. Finally, Chantal Lavallée, Assistant Professor of International Studies at RMC Saint-Jean, will present her paper on the EU's multilateral response to COVID-19. Most speakers will present in English, but the last panel of the day with Kim Thuy will be mostly in French. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for discussion at the end. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will read the questions to our speakers. When you type your question, please make sure to also identify yourself and the speaker to whom your question is directed. Now, without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Bruno to get us started. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Marina. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici et de vous voir tous avec nous. Merci d'être avec nous. Comme Marina disait, je ferai ma présentation ce matin en anglais, mais je parlerai avec vous en français cet après-midi. Et puis, évidemment, je peux répondre aux questions dans les deux langues sans aucun souci. Ma présentation sur le Conseil de sécurité, sa réponse, en fait, face à la pandémie de la COVID-19. So I always keep an eye on the UN Security Council because I work on conflict and intervention. I looked more closely into it when UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a global ceasefire back in March. It was a historical first, but if I am to summarize my conclusion here, it is very simple. The Security Council failed to respond adequately to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, or even to show some leadership in international crisis management. This failure might not be surprising given the historical limits of and recent tension at the Security Council. It is nevertheless worrying given the relevance of the Security Council as a principal organ of the UN that can enable or constrain international cooperation and as the world's authority in the use of force in matters of war and peace. It is worth remembering that the Security Council is the only UN body that has the power to make legally binding decisions for member states and to enforce these decisions through sanctions or the use of military force. So during the first half of 2020, the Security Council was deeply divided on dealing with or even acknowledging the impact of COVID-19 on international peace and security. On March 23rd, the Secretary General Guterres called for an immediate global ceasefire in order, I quote, to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives, end quote. The initiative was premised on the idea that wars allow diseases to spread while reducing local and international abilities to respond to their impacts. Guterres' call was an opportunity to support peace processes during international health crises. That was at least a theory. In the end, it took 3 months to pass Resolution 2532 on July 1st. But by then, the momentum had been lost. The practical effects on conflict zone has been nil. This failure to support Guterres' initiative was largely due to the result of tensions between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council and with the American and Chinese blame game taking center stage. It must be said that while several experts and international organizations projected that COVID-19 would impact conflict dynamics and produce instability, so far, its effects have been limited. Guterres' call for a ceasefire was nevertheless a missed opportunity to pause hostilities, to strengthen UN diplomacy in peace processes, and to promote international cooperation. COVID-19 is and will be a long-term challenge with serious consequences, as far as I'm concerned. Immediate and mid or long-term effects of COVID-19 on economic growth, on supply chains, and on food security, for instance, may prove disruptive and might induce conflict and instability. But let's take a step back and think and talk about the Security Council and pandemics in historical terms. In the UN Charter, Chapter 5, members of the UN confirm the Security Council's primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The statement, however, leaves open the question of what constitutes a threat to said international peace and security. This flexibility was part of the design of the Security Council as an adaptable political decision-making body for all contingencies. This flexibility is also in practice used by the permanent members to avoid any obligation to act on any of these threats. During the Cold War, the Security Council sidelined pandemics, even though the 1946 preamble of the WHO, the World Health Organization, the 1946 preamble constitution in the Constitution had acknowledged that link between health and security. It was at the turn of the century, that the increased attention was given to what some people call non-traditional threats, that is, climate change, pandemics, terrorism, and cyber attacks, that brought pandemics back to the UN Security Council agenda. Two quick examples can be given here. The first I'll just mention was in 2000 when the Americans argued that HIV/AIDS constituted a critical security threat in Africa. As a result, the Security Council passed Resolution 1308. In 2014, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa led to both a much stronger response in UN's first emergency health mission, but only after the initial failure of national governments and WHO. In a letter addressed to the Security Council and the UN General Assembly, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon cited the need to pair the WHO's strategic perspective with the UN's very strong logistics and operational capability in order to establish the UN Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, the UNMIR operation. This stirred up international cooperation, including the deployment of the American 101st Airborne Division to Liberia. And for some, UNMIR was a testament to the leadership of the United States. The Security Council response to the Ebola crisis provides a stark contrast to the case of COVID-19. And yet, early and clear warnings were also ignored until Ebola threatened the stability of the affected countries and cases showed up in the United States. When the WHO and affected countries proved incapable of dealing with the outbreak, the Secretary General forced the creation of UNMIR. For critics, instead of being a testament to American leadership, Ebola demonstrated the asymmetries in North-South politics of global health emergencies, presenting Africa as a disease-ridden continent and Ebola as a crisis of security for the West that seemed to put Africans, I quote, in the same category as politically motivated terrorists, end quote. So this is the historical background to COVID-19 at the Security Council. Historically, the WHO has prioritize the interests and protection of states from the global north, partly because it has worked on the assumption that says that disease contagion management and responses are more likely required in the global south, where so-called fragile states and thus the principal beneficiaries of its health cooperation activities are supposed to be. So COVID-19. At the UN Security Council in 2020, global health cooperation could have begun with a much stronger support for the Secretary General call for a global ceasefire. Warring parties in 11 countries responded positively to the proposal. While it must be admitted that the actual number of conflict actors that have picked up on the ceasefire idea is a little slippery, had the Security Council endorsed the appeal, it could have compelled warring parties and given momentum to different and various peace talks. At the very least, it could have been a powerful symbolic gesture in support for multilateral management of the COVID crisis. In contrast to this vision, the Security Council embarrassed itself over what should have been, in the end, a limited resolution that carried little to no risk for a permanent 5. Negotiations over a supportive UN Security Council resolution were protracted largely due to Chinese, American, and Russian differences. The Americans and Russians were concerned about the effects of a global ceasefire for their respective counter-terrorist operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, among other places. A much more important obstacle was the Chinese and American disagreement over whether to include a reference to the WHO in the resolution, which turned into a petty game between the Americans and Chinese governments. The position of the Trump administration made clear that it had abdicated US global leadership and that it conceived the UN system as constraining instead of advancing American interests. Instead, the Trump administration used COVID-19 for partisan politics in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election. It blamed China, it blamed the WHO for the global outbreak, announced in July that it would leave the WHO, and it stymied any multilateral response at the G7, G20, United Nations, and WHO. Throughout, while China worked hard to deflect international criticism of its handling of the outbreak, it consistently failed to offer a compelling narrative or rationale for Chinese global leadership. During months of deliberation over the COVID response, both countries succeeded only in demonstrating their inability or unwillingness to lead the UN system. Ultimately, it took over 3 months to come up with Resolution 2532. The resolution recognized COVID-19 as, I quote, is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, end quote, and demanded a ceasefire and a humanitarian pause for 90 days. The ceasefire did not apply, however, to military operations against the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and associated groups. Resolution 2532's call for a global ceasefire is in many ways a historical first, but it would quickly be forgotten as the call went largely unanswered. To me, this is not good news for pandemic global cooperation. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread, notably in the global south, political struggles over global health cooperation, distribution of medical resources and expertise, from masks to vaccines, economic rescue packages, recovery and reconstruction, and so on, will exacerbate patterns of global inequality, potentially causing instability and armed conflict. Years of progress in vaccination, literacy, reducing malnutrition, and reducing child mortality rates are at risk of, and in some cases have already suffered, major setbacks. So in conclusion, examining the international politics of COVID-19 through the lens of the UN Security Council, it is tempting to conclude that much rests and has rested on the shoulders of US leadership, which is now under, obviously, in the context of a new presidency. A change in leadership at the White House will certainly transform the political dynamics of the Security Council, but not necessarily Chinese-American relations. Moreover, a new American administration will offer no solution to multiple crises of multilateralism that preceded the Trump presidency if it sticks to old recipes, if all it can offer is some nostalgic idea about the benefits of an American-led pre-COVID, pre-Trump liberal order. There is no going back to normal, as far as I'm concerned, or to some sort of pre-COVID condition, partly because the virus will continue to kill, other viruses will probably come, and partly because the world has already changed. The magnitude and course of that transformation remain to be seen, but most importantly, claims about change must be here handled with care. Some will claim indeed that everything has changed to make sure that nothing changes, but that power structures and relations are sustained. So in light of the failures of the Security Council to deal with COVID-19, and in the context of the bigger challenge that climate change represents, debating Security Council reforms would be a waste of time if it is to simply reproduce the same conceptualization workings of the international order. To me, it is far, it is far from clear if the UN system can challenge and change the global structure in which it was built. But again, we also need the UN. Well, one thing is clear, the Security Council is not where one will find the seeds of change, new ways to reimagine the world, or alternatives for encouraging global cooperations. Advocating for mere tinkering of the international structure from which our major problems arise is insufficient, we need to be more radical in our thoughts and actions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruno. And now we'll pass over to Stephen Brown, who is going to talk to us about COVID-19 and development assistance.
It would help if I unmute it. OK, merci beaucoup. Comme Bruno, je vais présenter en anglais, mais également comme Bruno, si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, il n'y a pas de problème. Ça me fera plaisir de vous répondre dans la langue de votre choix. So when the pandemic hit, or soon after the pandemic hit, I noticed a lot of academics were sort of reorienting their research to deal with COVID-19. And to be honest, I thought a lot of that was very opportunistic, and it was sort of ambulance chasing and trying to get more funding for their research. And I sort of said to myself, well, I'm not going to do that. And then Bruno asked me to write an article of the impact of COVID-19 on foreign aid. And I've been working on foreign aid for more than 20 years. And I thought, well, actually, that's something where I will have something to say. And it's not just chasing the money and chasing the trendiness. So I looked into it. I did some research. I wrote an article. It's available, as has been mentioned already, in the special issue of International Journal. And what I do is I talk about a new context. So obviously, for anybody who reads the papers, it's clear that we're in a very new context. So there's a crisis of development. The most vulnerable, even if the infection rates seem to be higher in Western Europe, North America, it's actually the most vulnerable people, not only those societies, but abroad, that are hit the hardest. So even if infection rates are lower in developing countries, the effects are much worse. It's not necessarily possible to isolate or wash your hands or etc. Take the measures, stay home, take measures to prevent contamination. And a lot of people depend on being able to go out to earn a living. So it's a crisis of development. And there's therefore a much greater need for outside assistance. Foreign aid is one form of outside assistance or of revenue from abroad. There are others, such as remittances, so money that foreign workers send back to their home countries. There's foreign direct investment, there's trade. But all of those things have gone down with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's not only an increased need for development assistance, but specifically for foreign aid. So that's why I'm looking at what the impact is on aid per se. So I found three trends. Three types of trends. One is areas where there's a reversal of what was going on before in the foreign aid landscape, or new trends emerged, and I would consider them mostly good. So there has been in the past year, a greater focus on health, which I think was neglected in sort of the rush to fund things like infrastructure. More focus on immediate needs, so saving lives, social safety nets, and less on long-term growth. Now there's a debate about that. Some people say that it's actually better to focus on long-term growth because in the long run, you'll save more lives. But we can talk about that in Q&A if anybody wants to get into greater detail. But this greater focus on health is actually a danger to other sectors. So if our aid budget remains constant, we're spending more on health, that means we're spending less in good governance or access to justice or gender equality or education. And even if within health, we're allocating more money to COVID-19, that means we're allocating less to HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, etc. So there's a danger of COVID sucking all the oxygen out of the room. The other good new trend is a greater recognition of need for debt relief. This is less pertinent for Canada because Canada doesn't really provide loans, but there's been a growing debt crisis in recent years in the developing world, especially in Africa, and it's become more and more clear with the current crisis that countries are unable to pay. Responses from the G20, from the IMF have been slow and not substantial. They've postponed debt repayments, but they haven't actually canceled any debt, as far as I know. So those are the sort of new trends. In other areas, the pandemic has accelerated existing trends. So one thing that we've seen in the past 10 or 15 years is the donor countries are talking more and more about their own self-interest, sometimes couched in the language of mutual benefit, and that includes Canada. And with the pandemic, if you listen to anything that the Minister of International Development says, Karina Gould, or other politicians, cabinet ministers, the prime minister, when they talk about foreign aid in the area of the pandemic, they talk about the need to make sure that the pandemic is beaten elsewhere so it doesn't come back to Canada, that we're not safe until everybody's safe. So this is more sense, a greater sense that foreign aid is actually useful to us. Now this can be enlightened self-interest, but there's also a danger attached to that. And I'll come back to that in my conclusion. Also, there's more of an emphasis on humanitarian assistance, which has already been increasing. It used to be about 15 years ago, about 10% of foreign aid was for humanitarian assistance. Now it's 20, and it's going up, so immediate assistance. Now that's good in the sense that people do need immediate assistance, but it also means that we're just applying band-aids. We're not doing any prevention, or we're doing less prevention if we're doing more of the emergency work. This is in the context of foreign aid budgets not going up, and I'll come back to that point as well. Another positive or acceleration trend, which I would say is positive, is the greater recognition of the importance of global public goods. So Bruno mentioned climate change, the development of and distribution of a vaccine is another example. This idea that foreign aid or development cooperation isn't just the North helping the South, it's we're all in this together. Now, the extent to which we really are in this together remains to be seen, and I'll come back to that in a second when I talk about COVAX. And then the third accelerating trend is the decentering of North-South cooperation. That foreign aid, like I said, is from the North to the South. The pandemic has brought a lot more emphasis on South-South cooperation, so China providing assistance, PPE, China and India providing vaccines to other developing countries, Cuban doctors going to many countries, and also South-North cooperation, so southern countries helping the North. So China providing assistance to Italy. This is quite a change in terms of the way we think about the way foreign aid goes. And then finally, there are two ambiguous trends that there's sort of contradictory evidence. It's not too clear what is happening. One is, are we headed towards more multilateralism? And Bruno talked about that. So there's a lot more attention to Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and the WHO, the World Health Organization. But at the same time, there's a lot of vaccine nationalism, where countries like Canada have basically bought out almost all available vaccine supplies for this year, and developing countries will have to wait till 2022, or in many cases even 2023, unless manufacturing is ramped up significantly in order to have access to vaccines. So Canada says so much, and if you listen to the Prime Minister, he talks all the time about the importance of a just distribution around the world of vaccines, and everybody should have access, and it should be fair, and so on. But at the same time, we have enough to we have on order enough to vaccinate every Canadian 5 times. And there's this fund called COVAX that many countries have contributed to, including Canada, where the funds will be distributed to the 20% most needy people in every country of the world. And this is quite controversial, you might have seen it quite recently, is that Canada is planning to use, I think it's 2 million doses coming from that fund, so that people like me who don't fall into any risk category will be vaccinated before high-risk people or medical personnel in Ghana or Bhutan or somewhere. So that's not too clear. Are we heading towards more cooperation or actually more competition? And then the final ambiguous trend is, what will the impact be on total flows of foreign aid? Some donor countries like Germany have increased their aid. Some countries like the UK have decreased it significantly, just at a time when the world needs more foreign aid. In Canada, our plans are currently unclear. Whenever new announcements are made, the government is rather ambiguous about whether these are new funds. in the sense of in addition to the existing budget, or they're funds that are being redistributed or that just hadn't been allocated. So maybe when the next budget comes out, which I believe is next month, it'll be a little bit clearer whether Canada has actually increased its aid budget or not in response to the pandemic. So in conclusion, will these positive trends last, or the negative ones as well, I guess? There is a very strong danger of post-pandemic cuts to aid budgets. So even if countries like Germany are increasing their budget, when the pandemic is over, all the extra domestic spending in all countries will come under pressure. All the social security, the safety net, all the subsidies, all the that will be under a lot of pressure to be cut back, and foreign aid is often an easy place to cut back because the people who benefit from it don't actually vote in Canada or whatever the donor country is. So there is a danger of aid cuts. In the case of Canada, especially if the Conservative Party comes back to power, because you may remember from the last elections, they promised to cut foreign aid by 25%. They've backed away from that now, but in a context of ballooning deficits, it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't cut. Also, I'd say this enlightened self-interest justification will become less compelling. So if you say, people being sick in Africa can be a threat for Canadians or prevent us from traveling or holidaying abroad, people get that. But if Canadians start to think of that's what foreign aid does or should do, then why should we care about gender equality in Bangladesh, Bolivia, or Botswana? Because the lack of gender equality in those countries doesn't really affect Canadians. So if we become if we think more and more about foreign aid as benefiting us, then we're losing a sense of international solidarity, of compassion, issues of justice. And so we might be heading more towards me first. So what the future of the aid landscape looks like depends a lot on political will in Canada and other donor countries. And I think that will depend a lot as well on public pressure, whether we collectively put pressure on our governments to continue to spend money on foreign aid, to increase it, or not. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And now I'm going to hand over to Wesley Wark, who is talking about global public health security early warning systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and merci tout le monde. I'm going to be presenting my remarks in English and look forward to the questions. I wanted to thank Professor Charbonneau and Colonel Pilon for the opportunity to address you all. I'm going to make 4 points in this brief set of remarks. The first is really just to call attention to the need for and the current status of a global approach to collective health security. The second is to look very briefly at some of the findings that have emerged from the independent panel that's reviewing the WHO and the world's response to COVID-19. Then I'm going to zero in on something that I think is very important for us to understand and to get right now and in the future, and that's Canada's own early warning system for health security. And I'm going to end with some proposals about what needs to be done to try and ensure that we are better ready for the next pandemic. And there will be a next pandemic. That is the one thing that we can be sure about. So let me begin with this first point about global collective health security. And first of all, the importance of this concept. And, this is rooted in a set of realities. One is that diseases know no borders, and we've come to appreciate that with COVID-19, although we should have learned that from all previous pandemics that we've experienced. The second point that underpins this theoretical, at least, notion of the importance of global collective health security is that national defenses against disease outbreaks around the world are bound to be permeable and incomplete. The third point is that the best defense against global disease outbreaks are not nationally based, but they're actually rooted in early warning, which is the most important, I think, component of any pandemic preparedness plan, because early warning allows you to put in place preparedness measures with sufficient time, hopefully, to make them as effective as possible. But early warning of disease outbreaks cannot be a matter for individual national competencies. It again circles back to the concept of the need for a global response. Now, this is not a new concept. It was recognized in the aftermath of the SARS outbreak in 2003. There was an effort to build a kind of new international system for global health security after 2003, rooted in something called the International Health Regulations, which were meant to be the centerpiece for this global response to future pandemics, to be led by the World Health Organization. And I suggest to anyone listening into this topic, you may never have heard of the International Health Regulations, but it's something that we all need to be cognizant of. What are they? What are they meant to do? How did they fail? The International Health Regulations system was meant to be an impressive architecture for global responses to disease outbreaks. And I think it's incontrovertible that with the experience of COVID-19, the architecture that was created around the International Health Regulations failed, and failed completely. And so that really leads me to the next point, which is we are going to devote a lot of effort in different national systems and internationally to trying to understand why that failure occurred. What was wrong with the system that we created that allowed that abysmal failure to take place. And one of the important sources of learning lessons from COVID-19 is, I think, going to be the independent panel that was established by agreement of the UN and the World Health Assembly to review pandemic preparedness and response, both on the part of the WHO and more broadly globally. This independent panel issued its first interim report last month in January 2021. And it's an interim report. It's interesting and suggests that the final report is going to be pretty hard hitting if they can maintain the kind of approach that they've suggested. And I'm just going to, because this leads me into my third point, I'm just going to quote from an element of their findings to date. And this finding is headlined in this way: the global pandemic alert system is not fit for purpose. And I'll just quote from the paragraph of the independent report. It reads, critical elements of the system are slow, cumbersome, and indecisive. The panel has been advised that an increasing majority of alerts concerning outbreaks come to the WHO via news or social media, and is aware that platforms to collate epidemic intelligence from open and non-traditional sources have been created. But it finds the existing system to deal with alerts and to use epidemic intelligence from open source, as I say, not fit for purpose. It calls it a kind of analog system in a digital age. And it suggests that we need something very different so that the world can, and I'm quoting again from the interim report, enable reaction at the speed required, which is days, not weeks, to confront epidemic risk. So that is interesting, and we'll see where it goes in detail when the final report is released, which is meant to be later this spring. It leads me to the Canadian component of this, which is Canada's own early warning system for pandemic or major disease outbreaks. And Canada had established itself, or attempted to establish itself, actually as a global leader with regard to pandemic early warning. And this effort dates back to, in fact, the late 1990s, when Canada created something which you may have read about in the media, because it's become quite controversial, called the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, or GPHIN. GPHIN was remarkably partly shut down in the spring of 2019 for reasons that are not yet clear, but are going to be the subject of an independent Canadian review of GFIN, which is currently underway and is led by Margaret Bloodworth, who's the former National Security and Intelligence Coordinator for the federal government. The idea behind GFIN was to create a unique capacity, both nationally and internationally, a state-sponsored open source intelligence system using media scraping techniques, very sophisticated ones, to monitor the global media, to pick out signs of impending significant disease outbreaks before they might be officially reported. And the whole idea behind this system really was twofold. One was based on a recognition of the fact that the earliest signals of disease outbreaks are very likely going to come from what are called officially in the international health regulations unofficial sources. And secondly, that it is inevitably in the nature of the global system that there will be states that simply have inadequate capacity to report and respond to disease outbreaks, or may have an unwillingness to do so if they fear that such reporting can damage their reputation or might harm political solidarity in their country, or whatever the case may be. So Canada really took a lead by creating this state-sponsored open source intelligence effort called GFIN. But over the years, we managed to erode its capabilities to the point that it was not functional when COVID-19 broke out, which is really, to me, a remarkable story of failure that needs to be addressed publicly, and hopefully will be addressed publicly. The GFIN failure, we can go into more detail if folk are interested, was linked to another dramatic failure, which will also have to be exposed and corrected. And that dramatic failure was around risk assessment. Now, in order to make use of intelligence warnings or early warnings about disease outbreaks, you need both the raw data, of course, and an ability to pinpoint the raw data that really matters, but you also need a capacity to make sense of all of that raw data. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, GFIN on a daily average was looking at, using a pretty sophisticated technological platform, about 7,000 global news items per day. So that's a lot of information flow. You can only make use of that information flow if you have a risk assessment capacity, an analytic capacity that can say, well, these are the key news items that really look alarming, that matter to us, matter to the global community, and here's how we make sense of it. That's the basis of a risk assessment. The reality is that that risk assessment process was meant to be run by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And the risk assessment process itself was a complete failure. And I stumble over the word complete because it's probably an understatement. And I know this because I was asked to do an expert report on the risk assessment system for the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. I can't go into too much of the detail of the findings, aside from the fact that I found it completely amazing that it failed to the degree that it did. But that Auditor General's report will ultimately be made public, as well as the responses of PHAC to it. So the early warning system that we constructed that was meant to be a global leader was effectively hobbled by our own decisions. We had no risk assessment capacity. We had no capacity to either prepare ourselves in Canada for the coming of COVID-19, or to alert the WHO or the global community to what we knew about this. And that is really the whole point of the international health regulations, which is to construct a global community that can ensure the circulation of timely warnings about disease outbreaks, and that doesn't simply rely on any individual country to report out in a timely way. So the final point I want to make is really just about, and I'm out of time really, is about the new architecture that we need. And I would just say very briefly about that the government will have to restore GFIN, will have to build a new system for risk assessment. And I'm talking about the Canadian government. We're going to have to create something we don't have and have never had, which is an integrated health security system that connects agencies like the Public Health Agency of Canada to our broader security and intelligence community. We're going to have to work to strengthen the WHO, and it's going to need a lot of support. And the final thing is that we're going to have to look at reorienting our intelligence alliances, including, for example, the Five Eyes, to make sure that they can function as a collective early warning system in the face of future pandemic threats. So thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Bye.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hand over to Shahar Hamari, who's going to talk to us about whether COVID marks the end of globalization.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Brisbane on Australia's eastern seaboard, where the time is nearly 2 a.m. So if I seem a little bit out of sorts, please bear with me, but remember that I did manage to take off the cat filter before we started this broadcast. On that same account, I'd like to thank Professor Charbonneau for inviting me to this event, but also, given that many of us are missing international travel, for recreating for me that sense of jet lag that I always have when I travel to North America. So thanks for that as well. My talk will be in English. Our university is bilingual, but we speak English and Australian, not French, so I'll have to stick with English for you. For those of you who would like to read the paper, there's a bit more detail in there that I will not be able to get into. But unless you've been hiding under a rock, I think it's pretty clear that we're facing a very severe economic crisis at the moment. Some statistics that I can just throw at you very quickly just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. The World Bank estimates that global growth will decline by 5% in 2020, which is a staggering figure. World trade is now expected to decline by about 10% on 2019 figures, which is a bit better than previously expected. Foreign direct investment cut by about half. So they're all very dire numbers, as are declines in employment. So we're facing this very substantial, perhaps unprecedented economic crisis. And then the question that I posed in the paper is, what does that mean for economic globalization, which is the macroeconomic trend of the past 40 years. And without giving away too much of, without spoiling what's about to follow, I'm going to give you my basic takeaway message from this paper, which is that what we're seeing is not so much a turning point in the global political economy. What we're seeing is more of, if you like, COVID is acting as a catalyst for pre-existing trends of a move away from the hyper-globalization that we've seen over the past, say, 15 to 20 years, and building up on trends that were already in motion before COVID-19. So in this talk, as in the paper, I'll focus especially on what's happening with production, which under globalization has been enmeshed with trade and investment. And I'm also going to speak a little bit about global finance, both arguably the kind of two most important dynamics of globalization. So if you talk about globalization, we talk about production, we generally talk about global value chains, or GVCs, as those in the know like to call them. So global value chains, what are they? They're basically trade, investment, and production activities that happen across borders in the production of a particular good or service. So what that means essentially is the same good or service is produced across multiple locations, generally selected because they help maximize profits for the companies that sits on top of this global value chain. Now in 2019, just to give you an idea, about 70% of all trade was in global value chains. So this is a very substantial amount, a very substantial part of world trade. So we're not living in a world of the 19th century where, or even the 1970s for that matter, where complete goods, finished goods is in a particular location, then sold in other countries. Different components come together to assemble a good and sometimes even a service. But for some time, and for a variety of reasons, which I'll discuss very briefly, GVCs have been coming under some pressure. Perhaps ironically, the greatest amount of pressure actually has emerged from within the United States, And I'm saying ironic because the American corporations are the ones that have benefited the most from this development, but it has not benefited Americans equally, as many of you would appreciate. So we've seen, and of course, a lot of that is associated specifically with the rise of Donald Trump, but not just Donald Trump specifically. We've seen the rise of kind of hyper-nationalist and nativist sentiments from the United States, and arguably a lot of that is a result of the perception, if not the reality, that globalization has taken away a lot of good jobs from the United States and relocated them to other countries. Now, some people that might argue that actually at fault is not globalization, it's automation. I don't want to get into that argument because what matters more for me is the perception. And the perception is generally widely held by many Americans. And therefore, there's been increasing pressures politically as well on the American government to do something about that. Going to China, we've seen pressures from the Chinese side as well. Again, this is potentially surprising because perhaps no country has benefited more from globalization than China, given that its rise has been closely linked to the location of a lot of production activities within Chinese borders. But Chinese leaders have been for a long time concerned about being stuck in the so-called middle income trap. So the middle income trap is what happens essentially when you've benefited from cheap labor, but at some point as your labor becomes more expensive, the economy develops, the people that have located their production in your country because of cheap labor then move production to other countries because the labor there is cheaper. And they've been keen for a long time to avoid that situation. They've also been concerned for security reasons with having control over some sectors, especially in technology. So what we've seen is a variety of different measures that have been designed to push Chinese companies, whether private or state-owned, higher up the value ladder. And that involved a whole range of different practices, including sometimes even stealing certain secrets, industrial espionage, but sometimes various agreements with different companies. Now, this is not actually unique to China. A lot of Eastern Asian countries have done very similar things in their development process, but they're actually part of the US security umbrella, and therefore we're not seen perhaps as a major security challenge as China is coming to be seen. So increasingly, there's also been pressure as part of China's rise, both from the Chinese side to locate more sophisticated industries at home, but also from other countries to do something about China's trade practices and rising technological sophistication. So that leads us to a situation where we've seen what has been called by Henry Farrell and Abram Newman as the weaponization of interdependence, where especially the United States, but also China, using their very central position within the global political economy to try and apply various forms of economic coercion in order to get what they want, whatever that may be. And I'll get to that point later. So these trends were in place before COVID-19, and then COVID comes and it shows in very clear terms the risks of operating with very long supply chains. I can remember as long as a year ago, which is a long time now, probably can recall various fights over personal protective equipment or PPE, shipments being diverted, governments preventing exports of various technologies. Now we're seeing all sorts of argy-bargy relating to vaccines. The European Union recently threatened not to send vaccines to certain countries, including to Australia. Then they relented. But all these kinds of things are introducing all sorts of suspicions and concerns, both for governments but also for business, because previously they're used to having things that are done a bit more easily. So I don't believe the global value chains are going to go away, because we are talking about a world of 70% of all trade in global value chains. But given the situation that we're seeing, it's very likely that there'll increasingly be there'll be more efforts at reshoring, but also they'll be increasingly shaped by various geoeconomic new mercantilist drivers, as well as companies' profit maximization motives. All right, moving on to global finance in the time that I have. Again, global finance is a very important dimension. The liberalization of finance from the 1970s onwards has created a global financial world that by far dwarfs the real economy of trade and of goods and services. Nothing new about that. But what is interesting is that from the global financial crisis in 2008, essentially finance has been on some kind of state life support. And that state life support has come in the form of what has been known as quantitative easing, or QE, which is essentially a polite form of discussing the creation of new money. Out of nothing, really, because government can do that. Central banks can do that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but essentially they're doing. So in 2008, in the crisis that was threatening to derail the global financial system, central banks, especially the American Federal Reserve, were creating money and then in a variety of different ways, which I will not get into, providing that money to banks and other financial institutions, firstly to stabilize them, but also with the idea that they will then lend it and create activity in the real economy that will give people jobs and all the rest of it. Well, we know that that didn't happen. There are relatively limited flow-ons, but it created a massive asset bubble that created vast inequalities, a lot of resentment, because many of the people that created the crisis actually benefited from it quite handsomely, and a real disparity between people that own assets, whether financial or non-financial, and people that don't own assets, which is very many people. And even within those that own assets, a lot of assets, were able to then multiply that several times fold. Now, combined with government austerity, which many countries were also facing, we saw considerable resentment rise to the fore and the rise of various forms of populism on both left and right. Again, coming into COVID-19, we've seen basically the same response. The US Federal Reserve essentially released around $2.3 trillion around April of last year to stabilize markets. Again, most of that money remained within the financial system. But we've also seen new players coming to this, including the Australian and Canadian central banks. I just saw that the Canadian Central Bank QE program amounted to about $180 billion by around December. So essentially, we've seen more of the same, and when more of the same happens, we can expect more of the same results. So, growing inequality and resentment and so on. How long can this persist? Who knows? So just by conclusion, because I have run out of time, so what does that mean? Certainly for countries like Australia, with which I'm more familiar, and Canada. Well, these countries have for a long time benefited from a relatively open global economic system and have in many ways become dependent on relatively long supply chains, sometimes for very essential goods. So I think that there is increasing realization that this cannot be taken for granted. Australia has been suffering from a variety of trade sanctions from China. Many of Australia's most important exports to China have been frozen for a while. So they've been looking for new markets. So there is a need to diversify. But there could potentially also be a need for a return to some form of industrial policy. Industrial policy has become a dirty word in countries like Australia, but maybe that is exactly what we need in order to make sure that we don't find ourselves at a loss and unable to get access to critical goods and services that we need and that could potentially be denied to us if countries like China decide to apply the pressure even more. So without further ado, I'll conclude here and return to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, we have Chantal Lavallee talking to us about the EU.
Merci Marina, bonjour tout le monde. Merci aussi à Bruno d'avoir ouvert cette opportunité d'un numéro spécial. C'est une belle collaboration, donc merci encore d'avoir rendu possible. Donc, en ce qui me concerne, j'ai un peu le mot de la fin sur le panel et c'est bien parce que je vais pouvoir faire plusieurs liens avec ce qui a été dit avec un focus particulier sur une organisation régionale face à la COVID. Donc, dans ce cas-ci, l'Union européenne qui est mon sujet de prédilection, comme vous le savez. Moi, l'article que j'ai proposé pour le numéro spécial is The European Two-Fold Multilateralism and Crisis Mode Towards a Global Response to COVID-19. Et en fait, dans cet article-là, ce qui m'intéressait, c'est de réfléchir justement sur, de questionner de quelle façon l'Union européenne avait géré et gère toujours d'ailleurs. Donc, c'est bien modestement en fait que l'analyse se fait. L'article a été écrit pendant l'été, donc on est toujours dans la crise. Donc, de voir l'évolution de la gestion, c'est d'un intérêt particulier, mais c'est de questionner ce que la gestion donc, de la COVID-19 par l'Union européenne nous révèle sur l'Union européenne comme organisation, mais surtout sa position dans cet ordre mondial qui nous intéresse là, dans le cadre de ce numéro spécial. Le point de départ de mon intérêt pour cet article-là était évidemment de réfléchir sur les critiques initiales, comme vous le savez tous, dès les premiers jours de l'arrivée de l'arrivée du virus en Europe. La réaction de l'Union européenne a rapidement été critiquée. Il y a eu un manque de coordination, évidemment, de la réponse des différents États membres, une réponse qui a été surtout nationale pour répondre à la crise sanitaire, fermeture des frontières, donc réaction désordonnée, comme on a vu un peu partout d'ailleurs sur la planète. Mais dans le cas de l'Union européenne, on a vite critiqué l'Union européenne pour son manque de coordination et surtout de voir que les États membres n'ont pas utilisé les recours qu'ils pourtant ont à disposition dans le cadre de l'Union européenne. Et donc, c'est ce qui m'intéressait pour voir l'évolution dans la mesure où on peut avoir un certain recul de la gestion de l'Union européenne, de cette adaptation à la crise une fois que la crise s'installe, parce qu'on le sait que plus d'une fois, l'Union européenne a montré que c'est à travers les crises que l'Union européenne se définit et souvent on est sorti plus forte quoi qu'on en dise. Donc, c'était un peu ma prémisse de départ. Et l'idée que je défends dans l'article et d'où le titre, c'est ce double multilatéralisme et de montrer que finalement, rapidement, dans la gestion de la crise, le multilatéralisme européen est revenu, donc cette coordination étroite à l'interne des pays membres de l'Union européenne, mais aussi cette volonté pour l'Union européenne de prendre un leadership sur la scène internationale et donc aussi de coordonner, d'encourager une réponse globale à la crise, à la pandémie. Et donc, pour démontrer cette idée d'un double multilatéralisme qui a survécu finalement, qui perdure dans la gestion de la crise du COVID, ma présentation d'aujourd'hui va rapidement dire quelques mots sur en fait la gouvernance européenne qui révèle beaucoup de choses sur les défis de l'Union européenne de gérer cette crise. Ensuite, de voir de quelle façon s'articuler la réponse de l'Union européenne et donc ce multilatéralisme interne. Et finalement, comment s'articuler la réponse globale de l'Union européenne, comment l'Union européenne se positionne et essaie de finalement assurer une réponse qui reste aussi globale à la crise et de coordonner l'action dans les différentes enceintes internationales. Tout ça avec un certain regard vu du Canada sur ce qu'on peut retenir de la gestion de crise donc, au sein de l'Union européenne. So, having said that, now I will just start with a few points I would like to highlight about the EU governance, because as you all know, the EU governance is for some really complex and impossible to understand, but in any case, quite unique. And to go just in a few seconds, so just quickly into this to better understand the roots of the EU difficulties, at least at the early stage of the spread of the COVID-19. It's really this unique EU governance structures where indeed member states are in the driving seat, and the European Council, where the head of state of government guide the EU politics, but where also the Council, where ministers are sitting, are taking decision, and they could have really enabled more quickly the EU response, but it took some time, as I will quickly mention it in a few minutes. There were internal struggles, which is often the case when it's about to decide which direction, more Europe or a bit more mainly cooperations between states. So, but quickly the Commission came with many initiatives to also oriented and better coordinate. But as we should mention it is the European integration is indeed integrated in many areas. We all think about trade, agriculture, but when it's come about health sector, it's mainly in the hands of the member states. And I really like, in a funny way, with one of my colleagues, Sven Biskop, an EU expert, I've said at the early stage of the spread of the virus in Europe that ironically, the EU is better placed to deal with swine flu than with any human flu. And this is a nice way to explain also in which situation the EU was to deal with something in the field of competencies of the member states, where state was kind of using rather a national approach. And to also nicely frame the situation, I will quote also Joseph Borrell, as you know, the EU High Representative, who rightly states at an early stage of the crisis that in the rest of the world, health has become a security issue, but in Europe, it is a matter of integration. In his eyes, the pandemic is an essential moment. And for him, he quickly said that in March already, he argued that the way the EU will manage will not only affect the stability of every member state, but also affect the condition of future European integration. And I fully agree with him, and that was at the early stage. So I start really from that point, and to follow the evolution of EU management is quite interesting from this starting point. The first reaction was indeed a national reaction, emergency state, emergency health situation, and disorganized reaction that really coordinate. But then that came to my second point. If we look into the EU internal response, there are many initiatives which can be highlighted. I choose just the main ones. But just to say that after this initial uncoordinated, let's say, national response, internal struggles, as is often the case, between which options are the suitable for the situation, reluctant for key member states to go forward with the idea to maybe use EU tools to maybe indeed deep the integration to better fight the COVID-19. So after this initial phase, we have seen many EU initiatives discussed and pushed by the European Commission, which is the key supranational actors. And one of these is, as one of you probably all hear about, is this ambitious recovery plan. And if many states were not sure about the right format, this has been pushed by more and more states, especially by Spain and Italy, of course, who call for an ambitious European Marshall Plan for economic recovery, and support also by Macron, Merkel, the idea to also renew with the European solidarity spirit, but also the political dimension of the EU behind. And as you all hear, in July, that was the big negotiation, the EU summit, after a real marathon of negotiation, agree on this ambitious recovery plan. Many observers have described it as a really historical moment, because without even treaty changes, which is often the necessary way to adapt the EU to crisis, the decision was taken that for the first time ever, the Commission will be authorized to borrow funds on the behalf of the Union on the capital markets to offer them as grant to member states. So that put the Commission in a really exceptional position. And this big agreements, the main part of it have been agreed just yesterday by the European Parliament. So the main component was already agreed between the European Parliament and the ministers, so in the Council in December. But yesterday was the official approval by the Parliament, and just in a few days, the Council should officially approve. So that means they can go forward with this ambitious economic recovery plan. And also to mention this idea that quickly in the discussion came the idea that the EU should play an increasing role in health, and not just member states. The idea that the Commission could better coordinate actions between states, strengthen the idea which was already there somehow, but now is officially framed, the idea to develop an European Health Union. Mainly based on several initiatives, legislative proposal regarding strengthening the role, the mandate of the European Medicine Agency, also the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. And there I will come back to some comments from which have been said by Wesley Work about this importance to better to focus on the early warning, but also responding to cross-border health cooperations. And so the idea is that the EU want to strengthen what is already there. The EU Health Security Committee, where member states use more than 40 times, they meet since between January and November 2020 to coordinate the preparedness and responsiveness of the situation, to do risk assessment, to better coordinate their position at the member state level, but at the EU level. So the idea is to strengthen also other EU agencies, focusing really on this crisis preparedness and response measures. And also, as we also mentioned quickly, but the vaccine, we are all in this vaccination phase. And so the Commission and Member States agree already in June to coordinate a joint action at the EU levels. The Commission plan was to centralize and secure the supply and providing support to develop a vaccine. And this idea of this Commission entering into advanced purchase agreements which involve vaccine producer on the behalf of member states was kind of innovative, but is also one of reasons explaining this famous transparency, the use of the transparency mechanisms mentioned by Shahar, who have been quietly discussed here in Canada, in Australia, and many countries, even the UK especially, which are might be excluded or impacted by this. And time is running, so I will go a bit faster, but to complement this EU internal response based on an increased European multilateralism, the global response of the EU have been, of course, closely related to use this occasion to increase the EU leadership in the world, to use also contribute to the global response with different initiatives to support their partners, especially in Africa. And with Canada, we have seen also a joint statement where Canada and the EU are trying to coordinate their response to the COVID, but also to agree to really promote their approach, the importance regarding the multilateralism, and to use the international and organization, the UN, especially the World Health Organization, for a strong coordination. The G7, we mentioned also the G20. Stefan mentioned indeed G20, which have been not as strong as expected, but the EU as a full member really want to use this as a forward to really push initiative, and will use the occasion of the Italian presidency this year in May to organize a big global health summit to better prepare the world to preparedness and resilience for future pandemics, and to try to use to be proactive and also actively engage in the global response. Also coordination, so in the G7, discussion with Canada to use all the international forum and to cooperate together bilaterally, but also in the international organization as well. And also at the EU level, there were the idea to develop different tools, but to coordinate with NATO in different areas, notably combating disinformation on COVID. So there were also this idea to always think internal measure, but also how global response could be coordinated with the different partners of the EU. Donc, pour conclure, désolée Marina, je fais rapidement. Donc, ce qu'on voit en fait, c'est que la gestion de la crise par l'Union européenne a plutôt révélé, une belle opportunité pour l'Union européenne de consolider, renforcer l'intégration européenne avec des mesures extrêmement ambitieuses. Tout ça sans avoir à réformer des traités, parce que les États membres eux-mêmes acceptent de plus en plus de coordonner aussi leurs réactions, leurs positions, les décisions qui sont prises dans les restrictions qui sont décidées. Et donc, on voit à la fois une Union européenne qui, toute proportion gardée, on est toujours en plein milieu de la crise, à l'aube de la troisième vague en Europe, mais l'idée que l'Union européenne est peut-être mieux outillée maintenant pour réagir. Il y a eu beaucoup de leçons tirées des premières réactions de la COVID, et aussi l'Union européenne qui essaie justement d'asseoir son rôle de leadership sur la scène internationale, utiliser les instances pour aussi se démarquer, mais assurer une réponse qui reste globale. Une contribution, on l'a mentionné aussi dans COVAX, un rôle, une contribution qui est importante pour l'Union européenne dans la distribution des vaccins pour un peu balancer les critiques qui ont refusé de toutes parts face à la mise en place de ce mécanisme mis en place pour contrôler les exportations du vaccin. Donc, beaucoup à dire. Je suis ouverte aux questions. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Chantal. Alors, on va procéder aux questions. Il y a plusieurs qui ont déjà été répondues. Alors, je vais commencer avec celles qui n'ont pas été répondues. Some are addressed to specific speakers and some are more general. The first one for Bruno Charbonneau, and I know you guys can see them, but I'm going to quickly read them out anyway. In your view, and you've briefly touched on it in your conclusion, is the failure of the UN Security Council a sign that the multilateral or world organizations created under US leadership post-World War II need to be reviewed or updated in order to decrease tensions created by the current great power competitions? And this is from Colonel Francois Chamberlain, who's the Canadian Armed Forces military attaché in DC. So over to you, Bruno.
Merci, Marina. Bon, une grosse question pour commencer. Je la comprends peut-être comme étant une question à propos de quoi cet épisode au Conseil de sécurité est-il le symptôme? Est-ce que c'est la fin de l'ordre libéral international? Je doute je ne suis pas dans ceux qui annoncent la fin de l'ordre libéral international, mais plutôt, c'est clair que ce qui s'est passé dans la dernière année, d'abord, c'est un reflet évidemment d'une administration américaine très particulière, mais quand même, derrière ça, il y a évidemment tout ce qui est, disons, une multilatéralisation, évidemment, ou du moins un modèle international qui est de moins en moins unilatéral, de plus en plus multilatéral, ou du moins multipolaire, comme certains le disent. Donc, on voit évidemment le déclin, en quelque sorte, de l'influence diplomatique américaine, il n'y a aucun doute. Jusqu'à quel point est-ce que ça changera, disons, les dynamiques au sein du Conseil ou de manière générale à l'ordre international? Moi, je n'ai pas ma boule de cristal, mais il est clair, je pense que la leçon à prendre de tout ça, c'est non seulement le déclin, en quelque sorte, de l'influence relative des États-Unis, parce qu'on s'entend que les Américains auront quand même toujours un rôle très important sur la scène internationale, mais aussi les effets, disons, à moyen-long terme de l'administration Trump. Et je m'explique ici très rapidement, c'est-à-dire que bien qu'on peut s'attendre à ce que les diplomaties autres qui échangent avec les Américains voient dans l'administration de Biden au moins un gouvernement, disons, plus rationnel ou avec qui on peut s'attendre à certaines choses, je pense les gouvernements du monde, lorsqu'ils travailleront, que ce soit au Conseil de sécurité ou ailleurs avec les Américains, devront quand même prévoir qu'il est toujours possible qu'en 2024 ou par la suite, il y aura un gouvernement Trump 2.0 ou quelque chose comme ça. Autrement dit, toute entente dans le futur, je pense, avec un gouvernement américain devra considérer cette option que dans 4 ans, peut-être, il y aura un gouvernement qui, lui, encore une fois, reviendra sur sa parole ou nous amènera sur un chemin comme on a vu l'administration Trump nous amener. Donc, je dirais que en tout cas, je pense avoir répondu à la question, mais peut-être je pourrais y revenir tout à l'heure où mes collègues auront certainement des choses à dire là-dessus aussi.
Okay, the next question is for Stephen Brown. The Canadian government has alluded to providing any unused vaccine stock to developing countries. Given the assumption that this would happen only once a critical mass of Canadians have been vaccinated, is this really a viable option and a show of international solidarity, or just a maneuver for political capital? And do you think that this would be timely enough to actually impact COVID internationally?
So it's definitely viable, and quite honestly, I'm baffled by the fact that it has taken so long for the Canadian government to say what it would do with the excess doses of vaccines. Like I said earlier, we have 10 doses per Canadian, so at least 5 times over immunization requirements for each Canadian person. Obviously, this would depend on the approval of all of the vaccine candidates, but we already have 2. It looks like soon we'll have at least 2 more. So it's very clear that we will have excess vaccines. The Prime Minister has said that it's a hypothetical question. First of all, I don't think it's hypothetical at all. It will happen. And second of all, governments should plan in hypotheticals. I mean, you don't wait till something happens until you make up your mind what to do. You work on scenarios. So the government has been very cagey, and I'm really not sure why. To me, it seems like a no-brainer to say that you will donate to developing countries. The alternative is what? Sell them on the open market? Sell them to, you know, the UK or the EU? Already Canada is getting a lot of bad publicity for its decision to, as I mentioned earlier, to take vaccines from COVAX, which it is technically allowed to do from the Multilateral Fund, but that has been called immoral by a number of people, or unethical, people like Stephen Lewis, etc. Basically, Canada is like the guy who went to Walmart and bought all the toilet paper from the shelves. That's what we've done. We've just gone in, taken all this toilet paper, we're hoarding the toilet paper, and you know, so yes, we're gonna have an excess. It would make sense to be clear right now. One possibility is to donate the excess to COVAX. It wasn't set up for that, but it would deal very well with that, and they've actually said that they would be open to that.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Wesley Wark. You've stated that the best method to deal with outbreaks is not from national standpoints, but rather as international cooperation for early warning. The virus first broke out in China, and as China concealed this from the rest of the world, they blamed other countries like the US, India, and even Australia. Should there be consequences for nations who conceal epidemics? And how do you scale reparations or any responsibility for a nation who has done so?
That's an interesting question. And I must say that the question of China's response to COVID-19, I think is more complex than is sometimes delivered in media headlines. Certainly there was an initial cover-up, which was a product, I think, in many ways of the nature of the Chinese political system, and partly intentional and partly not, anyway, complex. The question of what to do with countries that fail to provide timely warning of infectious disease outbreaks, which is actually a legal requirement under the international health regulations, is complicated. Because at the end of the day, what you want to have is not a global system that is fractured by sanctions against non-compliers. What you really want is a global system in which everybody understands the mutual and individual benefit of complying. I think there's a role, and this is often the case when it comes to discussions about how you respond to international rules breakers. There are forms of deterrence you can put in place. There is an important role for shaming, to be sure. When you get to the sort of sharper end of the spectrum of responses, that is, punitive measures, it's unclear to me that that would be a very good or useful instrument in these kinds of cases. And I think the realistic position that you have to take is that with any major disease outbreak, there are going to always be circumstances in which you have to at least imagine that the country of source of a disease outbreak is not going to be either willing or able to respond fully, report fully internationally. And that's where you need a global system to kick in, so that if you have a kind of blackout of disease reporting from a particular part of the world, you have a capacity for other countries and the global system to step in. This is the whole point behind the WHO's EIOS system. It's called Epidemic Intelligence from Open Sources. It's the whole point behind the idea that I think now needs to be taken very seriously, that various national capabilities for intelligence gathering now need to be applied to global health security monitoring.
Thanks very much. Okay, the next question is not directed at anyone in particular, but it looks like it's probably best if Bruno would take it. The question is from Richard Sun. During the Trump administration, the US exited many international organizations. What impact will this have on the US's influence in world organizations under the Biden administration?
I have colleagues who know American politics better than I do, but I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about how will Biden guarantee, in a sense, what, let's talk, for instance, with a concrete example. The Biden administration is preparing a climate change plan or a climate action plan. And so it will, according to what we know right now, without the details, fully adopt whatever policy it needs to reach the Paris Agreement Accord for climate change. But, from any other government perspective, the question is, what will happen to such an agreement or such a project or plan in 4 years from now, given the fact that the American system can produce a government the likes of which we've seen under the Trump presidency? And I think that's the challenge for the Kenyan government, the EU, for China, for anyone really. How can you guarantee that whatever the American government commits to in the next 4 years will be sustained or durable, given the state of the American system? I don't want to go much more into depth here because I'm not an expert in American politics, but I think that's a crucial dilemma for the Kenyan government, among others. But like I said, pretty much anyone who's allied or wants to work with the Americans.
Thanks. Okay, the next question is from Officer Cadet Stefan Bobu. It's addressed to Bruno Charbonneau and Stephen Brown, but maybe Stephen, you could take a first stab at it. Considering the change in the nature of international cooperation and the response of the UN apparatus, will COVID change the way nations interact with each other? Will the United Nations mandate or functions shift following the issues you mentioned?
Yeah, like Bruno, I don't have my crystal ball with me, but the short answer is yes. The medium answer is yes, but not necessarily in ways that we can really predict. And the longer answer is that it depends. There's going to be a reckoning at WHO. Lots of member states will want to know why WHO reacted, how it did, when it did, why it didn't do things earlier, why wasn't it more aggressive about certain things. A lot will depend as well on how efficient the new or pre-existing multilateral mechanisms are. So if COVAX works really well, that can be a model for the future. If COVAX is a flop, then no. Will WHO be able to reinvent itself as, the go-to agency for this kind of thing or not? So definitely it will have an impact, but we'll have to wait and see exactly what, and that will depend a lot on performance.
Thanks. Bruno, do you have anything to add?
Very briefly, and then I would like to throw that ball to my friend Shahar, because I think we need to make connections to what he was talking about. Like Stephen just said, we don't really know. I suspect it is already ongoing, and it will have to, in a sense, if we consider not only the potential for more the pandemics, but also, again, I come back to climate change. In a way, COVID-19 is might be like a dry run, if you will, of what's coming in the next few decades. But I want to throw that ball now to Shar, because I think a lot of that question comes to what's happening also in the political economy, the financial markets, and I'm sure he'll talk about it. I've come up with different ways of doing things, let's put it that way. Deficit debates, for instance, have shifted. Governments print money all the time, and apparently without inflation, and so on and so forth. So I think that side of the equation we often forget about, and it will have, I think, a huge impact on state international cooperation. So I don't know if Shahar wants to intervene here, but I think there's certainly something there to be said about the financial side of these things.
Thanks, Bruno. Marina, would you mind repeating the original question? Just make sure that I respond to it directly.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what others can see. It's still open here. Considering the change in the nature of international cooperation and the response of the UN apparatus, will COVID change the way nations interact with each other? Will the United Nations mandate or function shift after the issues you mentioned?
Well, I actually wouldn't mind responding a bit more directly rather than going to the political economy side of things, because they're not entirely unconnected. But I actually think that for a long time, actually, the way in which most global governance institutions was working, like the WHO and others, was actually through fairly loose coordination. I mean, by and large, what was going on was standards were agreed to and various coordination mechanisms were created at the global level. And then it was really incumbent upon the various states to implement those domestically, right? That's essentially how the IHRs were meant to work. As Wesley was describing previously, they worked very badly. So if anything, we need closer cooperation and even various forms of integration, but we also need very strong domestic systems in order to actually make sure that these things happen, right? But because of the various challenges that were described by various speakers here, closer international cooperation is not very likely right now. So probably the best thing we can do is actually improve our domestic systems to the best of our ability. And this has just been, if you like, a kind of realist, a pragmatist in this context, rather than what I think really should happen. And clearly, you know, in the case of COVID-19, we can see very stark differences in how different countries responded, and that really falls back on what was there previously, and whether they had the systems, the institutions, the capabilities to handle COVID-19, or just the appearance of it, which in many cases was unfortunate, in many countries, unfortunately the case.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 14 open questions and only about 12 minutes left. So I want to start encouraging brief replies. This one for Stephen Brown. As the Government of Canada will most likely need to prioritize its spending abroad, is there a specific region in the world you would prioritize, considering the different logistics, supply chain issues feeding the Canadian economy? And this is also from Colonel Francois Chamberlain. Okay, thank you. I'm very bad at being brief, but I will try. Canadian law, since 2008, the Official Development Assistance Accountability Act specifies that foreign aid must be used for poverty reduction. So legally, we cannot use Canadian foreign aid to help Canadian supply chains. So I would say we can't do it for that, but to go back to the question, what region would I prioritize? Definitely Africa, because that's where most of the fragile and conflict affected states are. That's where the needs are greatest. That's where there's a lack of access to other forms of development financing. Okay, thank you. I think another one for you on foreign aid. Could one not justify decreasing foreign aid to utilize the funds to stabilize the Canadian economy, especially since Canadian unemployment is up to 9.4% and rising? And that's from Tajbir Rantawa. Okay, so that's a common question, variation on, you know, why are we spending money abroad when there's so much need at home? And obviously there is so much need at home. But that it's not an either-or question. We don't have to wait till we've solved poverty and unemployment in Canada to provide more assistance abroad. As well, money will go a lot further abroad. So maybe it takes $10,000 to save a life in Canada, but you could save 100 or 1,000 lives in Somalia with that money or something like that. So should we really save one life when we could save 1,000 or 10,000? That's just oversimplistic. Those statistics are more or less made up, but it's to give you a sense of that argument. An important thing to remember is that very little of our money actually goes to foreign aid. So 0.27% of gross national income.
And if you look at Canada's COVID response, so all the additional money that's being spent on COVID, whether it's CERB or anything else, 99.6 or 99.7% of that is being spent in Canada. So Canadian development NGOs are saying, let's just spend 1% of what we're spending in Canada abroad. Like, let's keep 99% for us, but let's just give like 1% of our COVID spending. But that would require doubling our foreign aid budget, and our government doesn't really seem inclined to do that.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Chantal Lavallée. Pouvons-nous tirer des leçons de ces initiatives par l'Union européenne? Les résultats des décisions de l'Union sont en effet publicisés en ligne et sont impressionnantes.
Merci. Oui, rapidement, en fait, une des leçons tirées, et c'était l'argument principal de la Commission européenne pour pousser ces initiatives, c'était de dire que les États seuls n'allaient pas arriver à affronter la crise, la COVID comme telle, mais aussi ses effets sur les effets économiques, la dimension sociale à long terme également. Et surtout, on en a parlé avec la présentation de M. Wack, d'être mieux préparé, mieux coordonner les positions des États. La coopération transfrontalière est devenue assez évidente. Donc ça, je pense, c'est une des grandes leçons tirées. Ce qui est intéressant, dans l'article, je fais le parallèle sur la tendance vers le fédéralisme européen et ce qui se passe au Canada. Et ce qui est assez ironique, c'est que Bruxelles s'est trouvé un peu dans la position d'Ottawa de soutenir, de coordonner la crise, de soutenir financièrement. Et depuis juin, d'être en charge de l'acquisition, l'approvisionnement des vaccins. Et hier, Ursula von der Leyen, la présidente de la Commission européenne, s'est retrouvée à recevoir toutes les critiques du Parlement européen sur justement les problèmes d'approvisionnement du vaccin. Donc, un peu ce qu'on voit avec le premier ministre Trudeau ici. Donc, on voit que rapidement, l'Union européenne, qui est maintenant en position d'être plus engagée sur les questions de santé, fait face à un défi majeur et les leçons tirées de la COVID vont dans plusieurs sens, mais la présidente de la commission, ce qu'elle disait hier, c'est d'avoir été trop enthousiaste, naïve aussi dans la question de l'approvisionnement des vaccins. Beaucoup de leçons à tirer sur en fait, l'importance de la coordination des États, mais aussi comment la Commission européenne aurait pu gérer différemment les commandes d'approvisionnement, tout le débat qui a été suscité par le mécanisme de transparence. Donc, les leçons à tirer sont pour l'avenir, comment, effectivement, pour la Commission européenne, maintenant en position de prendre des décisions et d'intervenir au nom des États membres sur des dossiers de santé. D'avoir aussi de prendre en compte qu'on ne gère pas des accords commerciaux, mais quand on commande des vaccins, on a vu la problématique avec la compagnie AstraZeneca. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup de leçons à tirer pour la Commission européenne dans ses nouvelles positions, dans ses nouvelles compétences en matière de santé. Donc, une réponse assez large, mais je pense que la Commission travaille justement sur en ce moment déjà comment mieux préparer la réaction à la troisième vague.
Thank you, Chantal. Okay, we have a question on China directed to the panel in general. I'm not sure who should answer it, so I'll just read it out and then maybe anyone who feels particularly well-placed can jump in. China has in recent years vastly increased its influence over smaller countries through economic programs such as the Belt and Road Initiative. In the UN, this influence has seemingly been reflected with an increasing amount of these countries siding with China on various votes and issues. There are even videos of senior WHO officials failing to address the existence of Taiwan, even when specifically asked about the country during interviews. Given this influence, how much can we trust conclusions from the UN and WHO that are in favor of China, such as the WHO ruling on the Wuhan lab as the source of the virus? And that's from an anonymous participant. Why don't we, Shahar, do you want to take that? Or do you want to start?
Thanks for the question. I think there are separate issues here. I think that the issue about the influence within the WHO is one issue, and then there's the issue of influence over various countries. Let's take the WHO first. So the WHO, actually, its history of subservient behavior towards its main funders is actually quite long-standing, and it relates to essentially changes that occurred from roughly the 1980s. In the 1970s, the WHO took what was seen as a fairly radical agenda of health for all on behalf of mostly the global south. That wasn't seen as a positive development by the United States and a variety of other countries. And then it was substantially defunded consequently, and most of its funding began to be delivered in the form of voluntary contributions. So that has created overall a culture within the WHO of not wanting to antagonize any of its major funders. So you can see a really big difference in China, for instance, between 2003, where it was not a major player. When SARS occurred, it was reprimanded in fairly strong terms by the WHO at the time for failing to cooperate. Whereas more recently, the behavior was quite different, and I don't think that is unique to China. I think it's actually quite common for the WHO not to take controversial positions. When it comes to influence of various countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, I think firstly we need to give a lot more agency to the recipients of Chinese development financing. Most of what we're seeing actually, even cases that are often attributed to Chinese strategic design and so on, when it's probed a little bit deeper, you can find that actually the story is a little bit more complicated, and normally there are a variety of interests associated with why the funds were received and for that particular purpose. But also, beyond that general point, there's another important dimension, which is that China, a lot of the money that it's provided through the initiative has actually gone into countries that suffer from a variety of domestic problems. They're unstable for a variety of reasons. And actually, many of the Belt and Road investments have created massive diplomatic headaches for China and did not yield the anticipated dividends from the investment of very substantial development financing funds sometimes. So I think we need to be a little bit more careful in terms of what we're seeing to be the results of China's increasing largesse. And just to finish off, I'll say that more recent developments suggest that China is actually providing a lot less development financing than it had been for a while. And there are a variety of theories about why that's happening, but one of them is that actually the returns are not there. And I'll just leave it there.
Okay, and I think Wesley Wark has something to add.
Sorry, just very briefly on a couple of the specific points raised. I mean, the challenge for the WHO is that it's an international body. It's a component of the United Nations. And as Shahir has indicated, it does have to work with all its individual international partners, whether they're major donors or not. That just creates a kind of political environment for the WHO, which it has to navigate. And different director generals of the WHO, I think, to be fair to them, have navigated that problem quite differently. And no doubt there will be ongoing criticism of how the WHO navigated its relations with China during the COVID-19 outbreak. But I'm not sure that's the sum total of the WHO's problems. There's a reference in the question to dodging the Taiwan issue. That was actually dodged by a Canadian official who works for the WHO. And I think what is not understood is that in the international health regulations, China claimed responsibility for reporting on disease outbreaks in Taiwan. And that claim was not something that the other members of the World Health Assembly could really do much about, or at the time perhaps wanted to do much about. Just on the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a potential source for the disease outbreak, I don't think it's surprising that the current WHO panel of experts, which is very international, has found that it's an unlikely source. That conclusion had already been reached by the US intelligence community sometime previously, so it seems to be really off the table. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there because we're supposed to end at 11:45. So I really apologize to everyone whose questions did not get answered. There were a lot of great questions in there that we unfortunately don't have time for. I want to thank all of the panelists for your really excellent contributions, and just remind everyone that we now have a break until 1 o'clock, and we return at 1 with an address from Brigadier General Simon Bernard. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you especially to the panelists. Unfortunately, if it was the real world, we would all applaud you right now and you would hear our applause, but you can imagine them. So thank you everyone.